Welcome back to Gospel First. And today we will be covering Matthew chapters 15 and 16 and Mark 7 and 8. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to look like you're doing fine spiritually while your heart is actually running on empty? Like the outside is polished, the routines are in place, the words sound right, but inside you feel distracted, irritated, maybe even a little numb. Today's chapters pull the mask off that kind of faith, not to shame us, but to rescue us. Jesus is going to ask in so many ways, are you close to me or just close to the performance of religion? So let's get started. Well, in the chapters, we open with religious leaders coming down from Jerusalem, and they come in hot. Their issue is not a miracle, not a teaching, not a healed life. It's about hand washing. Matthew says in verses 2 of chapter 15, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat." And Jesus does something he often does. He refuses to play small. He moves the conversation from tradition to truth, from the surface to the soul. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 3, the Lord replies with a bigger question. Why do you break the commandments of God for the sake of your tradition? Then he goes straight to honoring parents, calling out a loophole some were using to dodge caring for mom and dad. The point is sharp. You cannot claim devotion to God while neglecting the people God told you to love. Then in verses 8, Jesus quotes Isaiah. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Now that line can land like a punch in the gut if we let it, because it is possible to have religious lips and a distant heart. Then Jesus turns to the crowd and gives this principle. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. That's in verse 11. In other words, the real issue is not the dirt on your hands, it is the dirt that leaks out of the heart through your words, your tone, your contempt, your gossip, your cruelty, your quickness to judge. So let me make it more personal. If I want a spiritual dashboard light for how my heart is doing, I can listen to what comes out of me when I'm tired, when I'm rushed, when someone annoys me, when I feel disrespected. That is usually the truest reading. So here's one way to gauge yourself, to break that tradition that can really be helpful. Now, rituals can be holy. Structure can protect faith. But if the structure becomes the point, we miss the point. Jesus is recentering faith in relationships, love of God and love of neighbor, not church as cosmetics, but covenant as a connection. In this part of the segment, it's about a Canaanite woman. It talks about that Jesus goes to the region of Tyre and Sidon, outside the usual boundaries. Then a woman comes pleading for her daughter in Matthew. And this is one of those moments that feels uncomfortable on first read. At first, Jesus is silent. That's in Matthew chapter 15, 23. Then in verse 24, it says, I wasn't sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. She could have walked away furious, but she does something braver. She worships and she stays and says, Lord, help me. And then comes the statement about children and bread and dogs. That's in verse 26. She responds with a faith that refuses to let go in verse 27. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. In verse 28, Jesus answers, Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted. Now, sometimes the hardest part of faith is the space between asking and receiving. Silence is not always rejection. Sometimes it is an invitation to deepen, to clarify, to keep coming. Next, we see Jesus refuses the trap that is being set by the leaders about showing us a sign. We see in Matthew chapter 16, verses 2 to 3, Jesus calls out the mindset. You can read the weather, but you cannot read what God is doing right in front of you. Then he warns his disciples about the yeast, meaning the influence of their teaching, found in Matthew 16, verses 6, 11, and 12. Yeast works quietly but thoroughly. Ideas do that. Cynicism does that. Hypocrisy does that. If we consume it, it spreads. Next is the turning point question. It's where Jesus walks with them, the disciples, to Caesarea Philippi, a place thick with idols and competing gods. There he asks the most important turning point question. Who do you say I am? That's in Matthew chapter 16, verses 15. And then Peter answers in verse 16, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus says, this did not come from flesh and blood, but from your Father. That's in verse 17. Now this matters. The deepest conviction about Jesus is not just inherited, argued, or downloaded, it is revealed. In verse 18 of chapter 16 of Matthew, then Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church. Now, whether you emphasize Peter's confession, Peter's role, or Christ himself, the core point is stable. Christ builds his people on a foundation that hell cannot overpower. And then Jesus gets brutally honest in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, about discipleship. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. That is not a threat. It is an invitation to a life that is actually real. Now, here's a story that I like to illustrate this. A friend once told me about a season when they were very faithful on paper. They were consistent in church attendance, consistent in service, consistent in the outward checklist. But at home, they were sharp, impatient, always irritated. They finally realized, I'm offering God my public religion, but I'm giving my family the leftovers of my heart. So they made one small change. Before walking into the house each day, they sat in the car for 60 seconds and prayed one sentence. Jesus, let what comes out of my mouth tonight sound like you. Not a big dramatic overhaul, just surrender of the mouth, because the mouth reveals the heart. And over time, that simple prayer changed the atmosphere of their home. So here's the question to carry into the next segment. Jesus is not asking whether our hands look clean. He's asking whether our hearts are close. And that leads perfectly into Matthew chapter 17, because what happens on the mountain and what happens in the valley right after shows us both the glory of Christ and the gritty grace of Christ. So that's it for today. Thank you for staying faithful to the journey. May the Spirit continue to fill your heart and draw you closer to Jesus Christ. Again, if your heart feels even a gentle nudge, I invite you to subscribe and share so that we can spread the gospel of Jesus Christ together. And I'll see you next time as we continue our studies of Matthew chapter 17 and Mark chapter 9. Until then, God bless.